Born in June 1939 at Westminster, Edward was named by his father Henry III, after the last Anglo-Saxon king and his father's favorite saint, Edward the Confessor. Edward's parents were renowned for their patronage of the arts. His mother, Eleanor of Provence, encouraged Henry III to spend money on the arts, which included the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey and still extant magnificent shrine to house the body of Edward the Confessor. As a result, Edward received a disciplined education, reading and writing in Latin and French, with training in the arts, science, and music. In 1254, Edward traveled to Spain for an arranged marriage at the age of 15 to 9-year-old Eleanor of Castile. Just before Edward's marriage, his father, Henry III, gave him the Duchy of Gascony, one of the few remnants of the once vast French possessions of the English Angevin kings. Gascony was part of a package which included parts of Ireland, the Channel Islands, and the King's Lands in Wales to provide an income for Edward. Edward then spent a year in Gascony studying its administration. Edward spent his young adulthood learning harsh lessons from Henry III's failures as a king, culminating in a civil war in which he fought to defend his father. Henry's ill-judged and expensive intervention in Sicilian affairs lured by the Pope's offer of the Sicilian crown to Henry's second son, Edmund. But this campaign failed and aroused the anger of powerful barons, including Henry's brother-in-law Simon de Montfort. Bankrupt and threatened with excommunication, Henry was forced to agree to the provisions of Oxford in 1258, under which his debts were paid in exchange for substantial reforms. A Great Council of 24, partly nominated by the barons, assumed the functions of the King's Council. Henry repudiated the provisions in 1261 and sought the help of the French King Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, for his piety and other qualities. This was the only time Edward was tempted to side with charismatic and politically ruthless godfather Simon de Montfort. He supported holding a parliament in his father's absence. However, by the time Louis IX decided to side with Henry in the dispute and civil war broke out in England in 1263, Edward has returned to his father's side and became the Montfort's greatest enemy. After winning the Battle of Lewes in 1964, after which Edward became a hostage to ensure his father abided by the terms of the peace, de Montfort summoned the Great Parliament in 1965. This was the first time cities and boroughs sent representatives to the Parliament. Historians differ as to whether de Montfort was an enlightened liberal reformer or an unscrupulous opportunist, using any means to advance himself. In May 1265, Edward escaped from tight supervision. On August 4, Edward and his allies outmaneuvered de Montfort in a savage battle at Evesham. De Montfort predicted his own defeat and death. "Let us commend our souls to God, because our bodies are theirs. They are appropriating wisely. They learned this from me." With the end of the Civil War, Edward worked hard at the social and political reconciliation between his father and the rebels, and by 1267 the realm had been pacified. In April 1270, Parliament agreed an unprecedented levy of 1/20 of every citizen's goods and possessions to finance Edward's crusade to the Holy Lands. Edward left England in August 1270 to join the highly respected French King Louis IX in the crusade. At the time when popes were using the crusading ideal to further their own political ends, Edward, and King Louis were the last crusaders in the medieval tradition of aiming to recover the Holy Lands. Louis died of the plague in Tunis before Edward's arrival, and the French forces were bought off from pursuing their campaign. Edward decided to continue regardless. By the blood of God, though all my fellow soldiers and countrymen desert me, I will enter Acre, and I will keep my word and my oath to the death. Edward arrived in Acre in May 1271 with 1,000 knights. His crusade was to prove an anticlimax. Edward's small force limited him to the relief of Acre and handful of raids, and division amongst the international force of Christian crusaders led to Edward's compromise truce with Bibers. In June 1272, Edward survived a murder attempt by an assassin, and he left for the Sicily later in the year. He was never to return on crusade. Meanwhile, Henry III died on November 16, 1272. Edward succeeded to the throne without opposition, given his track record in military ability and his proven determination to give peace to the country, enhanced by his magnified exploits on crusade. In Edward's absence, a proclamation of his name declared that he had succeeded by hereditary right, and the barons swore allegiance to him. Edward finally arrived in London in August 1274 and was crowned at Westminster Abbey. Aged 35, he was a veteran warrior, the best lance in all the world, according to contemporaries, a leader with energy and vision, and with a formidable temper. Edward was determined to enforce English king's claim to primacy in the British Isles. The first part of his reign was dominated by Wales. At that time, Wales consisted of a number of disunited small Welsh princedoms. The South Welsh princes were in an easy alliance with the Marcher lords, feudal earldoms and baronies set up by the Norman kings to protect the English border against Welsh raids. Against the northern Welsh based in the rocky wilds of Gwynedd, under the strong leadership of Llywelyn of Gruffydd, Prince of Gwynedd. Differences between Llywelyn and Edward constantly led them to skirmishes. However, Llywelyn maintained that the rights of his principality were entirely separate from the rights of England. He didn't attend Edward's coronation, and he refused to do homage. Finally, in 1277, Edward decided to fight Llywelyn as a rebel and disturber of the peace, and quickly defeated him. War broke out again in 1282, when Llywelyn joined his brother David in rebellion. Edward's determination, military experience and skillful use of ships brought from England for deployment along the North Welsh coast drove Llywelyn back into the mountains of North Wales. The death of Llywelyn in a chance battle in 1282 and the subsequent execution of his brother David effectively ended attempts of Welsh independence. Under the Statute of Wales in 1284, Wales was brought into the English legal framework, and the shire system was extended. In the same year, a son was born in Wales to Edward and Queen Eleanor, also named Edward. This future king was proclaimed the first English Prince of Wales in 1301. This tradition exists to this day. As you know, the son of Queen Prince Charles was also given this title. He is the 21st Prince of Wales. He has been the heir to the British throne since the death of his grandfather in February 1952, but he received the title of Prince of Wales only in 1958, and the investiture took place in 1969 when he was 20 years old. But back to 1301. The Welsh campaign had produced one of the largest armies ever assembled by the English king, some 15,000 infantry, including 9,000 Welsh and Gascon contingent. The army was a formidable combination of heavy Anglo-Norman cavalry and Welsh archers, whose longbow skills laid in the foundation of later military victories in France, such as that at Agincourt. As symbols of his military strength and political authority, Edward spent some £1,800 on a network of castles and lesser strongholds in North Wales, employing a workforce of up to 3,500 men drawn from all over England. Some castles, such as Conway, Carnarvon, are still impressive. Edward's campaign in Wales was based on his determination to ensure peace and extend royal authority, and it had broad support in England. Edward saw the need of widened support among lesser landowners and the merchants and traders of the towns. The campaigns in Wales, France and Scotland left Edward deeply in debt, and the taxation required to meet those debts meant enrolling national support of his policies. To raise money, Edward summoned Parliament. Up to 1286, he summoned parliaments twice a year. The word Parliament came from the parley, or talks which the king had with a larger group of advisors. In 1295, when money was needed to wage war against Philip of France, Edward summoned the most comprehensive assembly ever summoned in England. This became known as a model parliament, for it represented various estates, barons, clergy, and knights and townspeople. By the end of Edward's reign, Parliament usually contained representatives of all these estates. With the able help of his councillor Robert Barnell, Bishop of Bath and Wells, Edward introduced many reforms and new laws. Edward's assertion that the King of Scotland owed feudal allegiance to him and the embittered Anglo-Scottish relations leading to war which followed were to overshadow the rest of Edward's reign in what was to become known as the Great Cause. Under a treaty of 1174, William, the Lion of Scotland, has become the vassal of Henry II, but in 1189, Richard I had absolved William from his allegiance. Intermarriage between the English and Scottish royal houses promoted peace between the two countries. But by the end of the 13th century, Scotland was left without a direct heir. In the absence of this, the disparate Scottish clans invited Edward to resolve the dispute. And the king, of course, took advantage of this. In order to secure recognition of his authority in reaching a verdict, Edward secured recognition from rival Scottish clans that he had sovereign authority over Scotland and the right to make the most important decisions. All this was both costly and conflicting. Not everyone wanted the English king as a sovereign of Scotland. By 1297, Edward was facing the biggest crisis in his reign, and his commitments outweighed the resources. Chronic debts were being incurred by wars against France in Flanders, Gascony, and Wales, as well as Scotland. The clergy were refusing to pay their share of the costs, with the Archbishop of Canterbury threatening excommunication. Parliament was reluctant to contribute to Edward's expensive and unsuccessful military policies. The Earls of Hereford and Norfolk refused to serve in Gascony, and the barons presented a formal statement of their grievances. In Scotland, Edward pursued series of campaigns from 1298 onwards. William Wallace had risen in Balliol's name and recovered most of Scotland, before being defeated by Edward at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. Wallace escaped only to be captured in 1305, allegedly by the treachery of a fellow Scot, and taken to London, where he was executed. The Scottish rebellion began with the assassination of the English sheriff William Castlereagh by William Wallace in 1297. According to legend, Wallace took revenge on the sheriffs for execution of his wife, who refused to reveal the whereabouts of her husband, who was wanted by the British. Wallace gathered a group of 30 men, captured the sheriff's castle, killed him, and cut the body into pieces. From that moment on, rebellion broke out throughout Scotland. Volunteers began to flock to Wallace's army, and he began to capture castles with the English garrisons. Often, Wallace used various tricks. For example, when taking the castle of Atresan, he set fire to the buildings that were behind the walls, and when the English soldiers ran out to see what had happened, they were killed. On September 11, 1297, the famous battle took place on the River Forth, near the city of Stirling, where about 10,000 Englishmen converged, including 3,000 heavy cavalry, and almost half of the number of Scots, who had mainly infantry and light cavalry. The British began to cross a rather narrow wooden bridge. Its width allowed 3 foot or 2 horsemen to walk on the same time. When part of the British crossed, they were attacked by the Scots, who were standing on a hill. They overturned the infantry and drove into the English cavalry. A stampede began on the bridge. As two waves collided, reinforcements pushing from the other side and English soldiers fleeing in panic. As a result, the wooden bridge couldn't stand it and collapsed, killing many English soldiers. The route was completed by the attack of the light Scottish cavalry under the leadership of Andrew de Moray, who crossed the River Forth. The defeat of the British was complete. The English governor, Hugh Cressingham, died. According to legend, the Scots took off his skin and cut themselves from its belts for bandages. After the victory at Stirling, the authority of William Wallace grew so much that he received the honorary title Defender of Scotland, in fact becoming regent until the return of the king. But the joy was short-lived. In 1298, Edward Longshanks himself invaded Scotland. The Scots tried not to engage in open battle with him using scorched earth tactics, and acted so effectively that Edward had to suppress the revolt of Welsh allies with the help of knights already in his own troops. However, the luck of the Scots couldn't last forever, and the English king learned that the Wallace's main army was at Falkirk. 1298, the Battle of Falkirk took place. Early in the battle, the undisciplined English knights attacked the Scots, taking heavy casualties, impaling themselves on stakes and being hit by spears. But at the most crucial moment, Edward was still able to put his knights in order and take them to a safe place, and the noble Scottish lords, fearing reprisals for disobedience to the English king, suddenly treacherously fled the battlefield along with the entire cavalry. After that, the English infantry lured the Scots out of their fortified positions with a feigned retreat, and the archers completed the route. But Wallace didn't give up. He organized a partisan struggle. but he never achieved much success, and in August 1305 he was extradited to the British by the Scottish Baron John Menteith. King Edward himself was present at William's trial as a chief accuser. Wallace agreed with all the accusation except betrayal, arguing that he couldn't betray the English king because he never swore allegiance to him. As a result, he was found guilty, and on August 23, 1305, he was put to a terrible execution. First, William Wallace was dragged along the ground, tied to a horse, then handed over the rampaging mob who beat, wiped, and spat on him. After that, they hung him, not letting him die, removed him from the gallows, castrated, gutted him, and burned his insides. At the end of the execution, Wallace's heart was cut out and his head was cut off, and his body was quartered. Wallace's head and the head of his brother were nailed to London Bridge, and their limbs were sent to 4 Scottish cities in order to terrify and pacify the proud Highlanders. I must say, this had the opposite effect, and the wars for Scottish independence lasted for a very long time. William Wallace lost and was put to a savage execution, but became a symbol of the struggle of the Scottish people for their independence, for which he was awarded a huge monument and several statues, as well as the honor of being played by Mel Gibson. If you didn't watch the movie Braveheart, I highly recommend it. You will definitely not remain indifferent. And what about Edward? In 1304, Edward summoned a full parliament, which elected Scottish representatives also attended, in which arrangements for the settlement of Scotland were made. The new government in Scotland featured a council which included Robert the Bruce. Bruce unexpectedly rebelled in 1306 by killing a fellow councillor and was crowned King of Scotland at Scone. Despite his failing health, Edward was carried north to pursue another campaign, but he died en route at Borough-on-Sands on 7th July 1307, aged 68, succeeded by his son Edward II. According to chroniclers, Edward requested that his bones should be carried on Scottish campaigns and that his heart be taken to the Holy Land. However, Edward was buried at Westminster Abbey in a plain-back marble tomb, which in later years was painted with the words Scotorum Malleus, Hammer of Scots, and Pactum Serva, Keep Troth. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, the Exchequer paid to keep candles burning round the body of the Lord Edward, formerly King of England, of famous memory. Guys, have you watched the movie of Braveheart? I'll really appreciate your opinion on it. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please let me know by hitting the thumb up. Please also subscribe to this channel. And while you're there, why not to hit the notification bell next to subscribe button, so that YouTube tells you what I've next uploaded. I look forward to speaking to you in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.